Earlier on in this podcast, I teased the fact that we have a very, very special bonus for you that we're going to go into now, where we spoke with Joe about the release of his new book, which is closely allied to the book that we read from so liberally during the 70s run of albums, Days of the Underground. This is called Sideways Through Time, and it's great to see more Hawkwind content coming from Joe Banks. So it's time to slide sideways through time with Mr. Joe Banks, and here it is. Joe, wonderful to see you again. How are you?
I am good. Thanks so much for having me on and doing this. It's really, really kind of you to allow me to keep plugging away at all of my various things and just generally being on a PR bonanza.
Not at all, Joe. You're part of the crew. This feels particularly good because with you bringing out a new Hawkwind book, this feels like you've come home, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. To the place where Hawkwind is discussed and ruminated over. So this is obviously different from Days of the Underground in as much as this is actually just me editorializing, having asked the questions, and it's the kind of Hawk crew themselves speaking. But yeah, great to be here.
Now, before we start, this will appear at the back end of our Alien 4 episode, which we are about to record. So without giving anything away from our side, although listeners will just have had probably about 2 hours worth of Matt and I, where do you stand on Alien 4?
It's where Ron Tree joins. I think, as you perhaps discussed, they were becoming more and more like an instrumental outfit, and they certainly didn't have a defined frontman. And I think getting Ron Tree in was all about having a bit more of a focus live again. But then he very much brings his own personality to the album and is Calvert-esque in places. So it's an interesting album from that point of view. There's definitely some good stuff on it. The recording is very much a Dave Brock production. It's quite grungy in places, but it's an interesting album. So I think you'll have a lot of fun with it.
So, Joe, Sideways Through Time, which has just come out, and most excellent it is too, been leafing through it. It has an interesting history, doesn't it, with regard to the tome Days of the Underground that we read from so liberally during our 70s episodes.
Yeah, so this was originally a book which was given away with the special edition of Days of the Underground. So Days of the Underground is still available in paperback, but there was 500 copies of a special edition when it first came out, which was hardback. And one of the things that came with it was this book of interviews, because I'd ended up speaking to so many people during the writing of the book that it seemed absolutely crazy that most of this stuff I just wouldn't be able to use. And so I discussed with Stranger Tractor, the publisher, why don't I just do this book of interviews and just stick the interviews in a separate book. But obviously there was a lot of people who only heard about the book after the special edition had sold out, but they heard about this extra book and going, oh my God, why can't we get this? We want to get this. And so over the space of 2 or 3 years, kind of come round to the idea that maybe I should do another version of it, especially because in that time I'd ended up speaking to quite a few Hawkwind people and Hawkwind related people who I hadn't got to the first time round. And so there was extra material. So that's basically why it's come out. I was slightly wary of people who got the special edition and wanted this very rare freebie, as it were, for themselves. But I think for the most part, people have been fine about it. And as is the way of Hawkwind fans, they're probably all going to buy it again anyway, which is very kind of them to do that.
Is this like your Silmarillion?
Well, I call it an oral history, which, as I say in the introduction, is a bit of a cheat because oral histories are usually a book which is composed out of the voices of different people, but they're kind of cut together. This person says this, person says this, whereas this is much more just a book of interviews. Obviously, it's me who's asked the questions and has guided the interview. And by the questions I've asked is how I've got the responses that have come out. And it's quite interesting because, I mean, you speak to people who had clearly been interviewed a lot before, and often people will fall back on kind of set responses. And there, the job is to try and get them to say something different or think about things in a different way. So that was some of the interviews. But quite a few of these people, and this was one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this book, they hadn't kind of really spoken on record at all before, or certainly not for a very long time. So I think there's some very, very interesting people in the book that people just won't have come across before, who are actually, though, really important to the Hawkwind story.
Of all of those interviews that you did when you were putting Days of the Underground together, are there any that you remember particularly fondly?
Well, I mean, they were all all special because obviously, it becomes very real when you say, I'm going to write this book. And then you think, OK, so I need to speak to people. And then you suddenly think, oh, my God, I'm going to be speaking to Dave Brock. I'm going to be speaking to Nick Turner. These people who, when you grew up and you were uber Hawkwind fan, and these are the guys, and then suddenly you're talking to them. And it's quite funny after, as long as you're reasonably well prepared, after 5 or 10 minutes, pretty much everybody was very nice, good with their time. I was thinking about this, though, in terms of the interviews I really enjoyed. Alan Powell, who was the second drummer from 74 through to 76, he was very, very funny. He's a Mancunian guy, lives in America now, but he was very, very funny. But I think probably the interview that I was most amazed to get was the interview with Pamela Townley, who was Robert Calvert's second wife. And that's the one which is right at the end of the book. And that really is one of those interviews that really does give you an insight into Calvert in a way that nobody else really was able to. And that was just one of those things where I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to get hold of this person and find her. And even if I can, she's going to say, I absolutely don't want to do this. As it was, I managed to track her down when I put my mind to it relatively easy. And she was absolutely delighted to talk about Robert. As she says, being married to Robert was one of the most amazing things in her life, even if they did divorce after 3 years. But yes, that was a really amazing interview.
I can totally imagine. And in putting the book together, obviously you've brought out Days of the Underground. You've then done an enormous amount of work on the Peter Hamill book. So did you have to do an awful lot of work to put these interviews into shape for this book? And did that mean juggling this and Peter Hamill?
It is funny getting into a slightly different headspace between them. There's 8 new interviews in this book, so they had to be properly edited down and put into the right format. So I did that, and then I rejigged the order of some of the interviews. It was obviously a chance to go back through things. And I mean, what takes the time is just formatting stuff, thinking, oh, gosh, this title needs to be in italic. That's actually kind of what takes the time, because I'm quite fastidious about that. I try to be as much as possible. But also on this edition as well, there's some visual material in it, which wasn't in before. I've tried to put in the most obscure but funny cuttings I can find. Like a lot of the times, the Hawkwind actually were covered by the national media in the 1970s. It's quite funny, and it's all cuts about Lemmy being on a drugs charge and Terry Ollis drumming in the nude, Stacey in the nude. There's quite a lot of nudity. So assembling it did take a little bit of time, but the framework was already there from the original book, so it wasn't too bad.
Did you have anyone who came to you because they knew you were making a book? Or did you literally have to go out and do all the work?
So mostly it was me going out, and occasionally that would be through a PR, but mostly it was just finding people who had contacts for people. So, for instance, the new interviews, I spoke to a guy called John May, who had been one of the dancers on the Space Ritual tour. And then he said, oh, would you like to speak to Jamie Mandelkow, who's the Canadian manager of the Deviants and then the Pink Fairies? And he then becomes involved with Hawkwind. And there's no way I would have been able to find him. I had no idea where to start. He's in Canada, and, and obviously all these guys are in their 70s. So then I got in contact with him, and that was a particularly good interview because the whole thing was done by email. And he wrote in this real stream of consciousness way, which, as I said in the book, I completely retained because there's no point me trying to edit it. But then he said, do you want to speak to Corinthia West? And I'm like, who's Corinthia West? And she's like, it was Nick Turner's old girlfriend. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And then, of course, I remembered, actually, I know this name, Corinthia West, because it was where Cynthia Beat, who had done the film of Hawkwind at Wembley, she had lived in the same house. And so, the whole thing kind of worked like that, basically, connections within connections.
I'm picturing you, Joe, like a private detective following one lead after another and going down this rabbit hole.
It literally is like that. And sometimes you are just kind of ringing people. Like, for instance, Dick Mick, who sadly died during the writing of the book. I mean, I spoke to him probably 6 months before he died, and he hadn't spoken on record at all for years and years and years and years. And I'd spoken to Nick Turner, and Nick Turner had given me his contact. It's not email, it's just a phone. And you're suddenly just in this position where you have to phone somebody. It's like, who the hell are you? And I managed finally to connect with him. I think I left a couple of voicemail messages, and I subsequently discovered that Uber Hawkwind fans Wolfie Smith and Pedro Bellavista, who you may have come across in the Hawkwind Facebook groups, it just so happened that they had also connected with Dick Mick recently and had found out, I think, that I was doing this book, and they were saying, you should speak to him, you should speak to him. So it was just like factors like that meant that I got to speak to people who otherwise might not have even given me the time of day. I had a similar experience with Doug Smith, where I just had to kind of ring him up and try and explain who I was. You have about 10 seconds to explain yourself before somebody puts the phone down on you. Doug was very funny because, oh, no, I said I wasn't going to do this anymore. And then he was like, oh, okay, I suppose so. And then Doug ended up being my guiding angel through the whole process because he knew everybody and he was brilliant at fact checking. And I spoke to him loads and loads and loads. So he was absolutely brilliant.
When you wrote the book or when you wanted to write the book, how much of it were you relying on being able to speak to anyone? Because I guess for us, the way that we work is that we are very much a satellite entity around Hawkwind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't
Mm-hmm.
need them, and we haven't really reached out. And in fact, with that whole impartiality thing, for us, it actually may not help for us to actually speak to some of them, you know. But for you, obviously, it's a very important, integral part. Do you feel like you could have written the book without it, or was it literally without it, there would be no book?
That's a really, really excellent point because when I started getting the idea together for the book, as you know, I mean, it's not a straight biography. It's got all of these essays in. And originally, I didn't want to write like an academic book, but it was much more me wanting to talk about the cultural aspect of Hawkwind. And I had thought I probably should speak to some people, but I don't necessarily intend to speak to lots of people. And it literally became just this chain thing where one person said, oh, you should speak to this person. And it grew and grew and grew. But if you actually look at the Days of the Underground, I mean, I chopped in 10 interviews. And again, I pulled them out as interviews rather than trying to integrate them into a text. And the book could still function without those 10 interviews. But having that material, it was like, okay, well, you know, I've got an interview with Nick Turner. I've got an interview with Pamela Townley. I've got to put this stuff in because it's fantastic. To answer your question in a way, did I learn stuff by speaking to people that absolutely informed what I wrote? Yes, but not as much as you'd think. In a way, because it was about the 1970s, I was more interested in pulling the quotes from contemporary sources and seeing what they had said and what the press had said and other people had said at the time. I could have done it probably without really speaking to anybody, but having started doing that process, as I said, it then completely exploded. And that's why we've ultimately ended up with this second book of interviews. But it's a good question, actually, because a lot of biographies, it seems like people think, okay, all I need to do is interview XYZ, string all of the quotes together, bingo. I'm constantly surprised, actually. You read music biographies and listen to slag anybody off, but the amount you read where you think you get a fairly mundane quote from somebody and they've put it in just because it's this person saying it, rather than thinking, you know what, I'm not going to include this quote because it's not very interesting. And then a page later, another band member says exactly the same thing, which is also really mundane, but it's like the writer saying, but look, I got to speak to this guy. You know, it's almost like saying, I've spoken to all these people, therefore my book has legitimacy. And right from the very start, I had some ideas that I wanted to get over, and they were, to me, more important than just, you know, running through a load of interviews and talking to people that people have already spoken to before.
Well, I'd say you definitely succeeded in that. Going to the interviews, because of the range of people you spoke to, was there anyone you spoke to who was on the outside of it or hadn't been around for a long time, who didn't get approached, who wasn't in the press, who was actually really interested in, oh, I get to talk about my experiences now, and then it kind of all comes out? Did you have that from anyone?
Yeah, there was a few people. So, for instance, Mike Hart, who is one of the original Lensmen, he was one of the few people who found out that I was doing this and directly did get in contact with me and said, I'd like to contribute to your book. Because I think if you read other biographies of Hawkwind, I think certainly Carol Clark's, there's a mythology has grown up whereby, you know, Hawkwind's amazing lighting was all down to John Smeaton, Liquid Len, and everybody else was just his kind of assistants. Whereas Mike Hart wanted to say he was with another guy in a light show called Proteus Lights before John Smeaton was on the scene, and he had worked with Hawkwind on and off for quite a long time. And it was when John Smeaton arrived, at that point, they pooled resources and became Liquid Len and the Lensman. But he was very keen on getting his place in history, if you like, which he felt had slightly been kind of missed out. I remember as well, one of the first people, and again, this was through Nick Turner, I got in touch with was a guy called Jerry Fitzgerald, who had kind of been their fix-it man, head technician in the early 70s, working for the Space Ritual period. And he was actually one of the few people I actually went to visit. He said, oh yeah, come and see me. So I went to see him. And Jerry, unfortunately, also died during the writing of the book. That was quite an experience because he was clearly not well at the time, but he was desperate to literally give me his whole life story from that period of time. And I've got hours and hours of speaking to Jerry, mostly not about Hawkwind, Hawkwind. And a lot of the stuff was absolutely fascinating. But, I was sitting there thinking, okay, and I'm back to Hawkwind. So it was a bit awkward.
That's nice, though, that people get closure in that way, isn't it? It's nice that you've actually been a channel for people to have that experience. That must feel quite good.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, as I said, you speak to Nick Turner. I mean, he was brilliant, but a lot of what he was telling me was kind of stuff he told lots of other people. And that sounds incredibly ungrateful saying that. But as a writer, half of you is constantly thinking, okay, I've heard this before. I need to get something new out of you, or you need to tell me something different. Whereas then you have other people, and as I say, Pamela Townley is a prime example of this, who've never spoken before at all. And everything they're saying is gold. And you're like, wow, it's almost a bit overwhelming. But as he said, yeah, for some people, they really love the fact that they'd had a chance to speak about Hawkins, although half of them would always preface by saying, well, it was a very long time ago. I don't ever remember anything. But they usually did remember something. It's just a real privilege to speak to that amount of people from that time as well, because it's a real window into another world from what we're living in now.
Absolutely. We're living in an interesting period of time where there's an interest in writing these stories and putting them out, people putting their own personal experiences of Hawkwind out, which is Paul Garbutt's book and things like that. And it's a really lucky time for us to be able to get hold of all these things. And I just have to say that I massively enjoyed Days of the Underground when that book came out and loved reading from it during our 70s episodes. And now to have all of the interviews and the research and all of those stories behind that book come out, it almost feels like here's the book and here's the making of, and you've kind of got the whole thing. Basically, it's fantastic to have it, Joe.
Thank you.
I'd also point out for people listening that your website, Days of the Underground, is an amazing library of different Hawkwind artifacts of videos and essays and photos and everything. So I definitely point people in that direction. Thank you for writing these wonderful books. We will look forward to Peter Hamill.
That's going to be even longer. Yeah, even longer than Days of the Underground. Believe it or not, it is vast.
I can imagine 2 years after your Peter Hamill book, there is a book of all of the interviews that went into the Peter Hamill book. Is this the Joe Banks formula now for sequels?
I was thinking about that, but actually I've interviewed far less people for the Peter Hamill book. Though I will find a way for some of that to get out that hasn't got into the book. But I don't think there's going to be a similar Sideways Through Time thing, but we shall see.
Fantastic. So the book is from Strange Attractor, Joe?
It is, yeah.
Excellent. And available from all good bookshops?
Actually, no, it's not. No, that's the thing to point out is that it is available through places like Rough Trade, but this one's just being sold through Strange Attractor's website. So it's not on Amazon. It's not on any other online site. It's just through Strange Attractor. And as I said, it's also made it into a few specialist record shops.
That makes it much cooler and definitely good for everyone to know. If you're looking at it at all of the big online places, Amazon, etc., not finding it, this is where to go. Then go to Strange Attractor. Or if you're buying something from Rough Trade, maybe the Rough Trade exclusive splatter vinyls of the new remasters, then you might come across Sideways Through Time by Joe Banks. And we will see, hopefully, if Joe's happy to do it, Joe Banks coming back for the Hawkwind album, which comes out next year when our reaction crew can reassemble.
I would be very, very happy to do that. What's the title of that again? No Space for Us?
Space is Not For Us, or No Space for Us?
Yeah, something like that. That's interesting. I'm already feeling it's a third part in a trilogy, but I may be completely wrong.
Indeed. We will find out. Joe, thanks for making the time to come on and talk to us about the book. It's a beautiful thing. I'm sure it'll be a big success, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you very much, guys. Really enjoyed it. See you soon.